Patch 10.13 is the final Smite patch of the year, and it brings a new god and plenty of balance changes. Here's your patch day recap for everything you need to know. Kicking it off with that new god, 10.13 brings Bake Kujira, who enters the battleground as a bruiser solo lane guardian focused around basic attacks. His passive curses enemies that hard CC him, reducing their damage output. He also cannot gain attack speed and converts any he builds into haste, removing some of his basic attack movement penalty. He also converts 30% of his protections from items and abilities into basic attack damage. Bake's 1 is a stim that increases his basic attack range and grants 50% haste. He also gains stacking protections per enemy hit with his basic attacks during this time, up to 10 stacks. Bake's 2 is a simple cone damage ability that also applies his passive curse. If the enemy was already cursed, the effect is doubled. While this ability is on cooldown, basic attacks on gods reduce it by 1 second and 0.1 second for minions. Bake's third ability is his main movement, in which he dashes forward after a short charge up and pulls enemies with him, stunning them at the end. And finally, Bake's ultimate creates 2 rings around him for 5 seconds. The inner ring makes enemies take more damage, while the outer ring time dilates enemies. Bake also gains bonus basic attack damage for the duration. Moving on from the new god though, we of course have some skins for this patch as well. Bake's recolors, mastery skins, and year 10 pass of course, as well as the new V Shoujo skins for Mulan, Persephone, Nemesis, and Izanami, and finally a new Colorforge skin for Heimdall and Cybernetic Overlord Hades. Moving on to the balance changes for 10.13, first up, the 32 top performing gods of ranked duel are now automatically banned. This should massively shake up the meta as people search for what was good but not great in the previous meta. Moving on to items, first up is Typhon's Fang, which loses 5 power and 50% of the magical lifesteal to power conversion, so it now only gives 1.5 times your lifesteal as power as opposed to 2 times. Vampiric Shroud loses magical power, magical lifesteal, and health and mana restore on hit. Bloodsoak Shroud loses 10 power, and the health and mana restore is now 1% for both, when it was 1.2 and 1.5% for health and mana respectively before this. Pythagorean's Piece loses a total of 4% lifesteal and 10 power, some from the aura and some from the base stats. Enchanted Trinket, the tier 2 item, gets similar changes. Breastplate of Valor loses 5 physical prots and 5 MP5. Berserker Shield, Glad Shield, and Phalanx all get 50 gold cheaper and have 50 more health. Pestilence is 100 gold cheaper now and has 15 HP 5 on it. Archdruid's Fury gains 5 of each protections. Dawnbringer now has 15 HP 5 on it as well. And finally for items, Warrior's Axe gains 5 physical power. Moving on to god changes for 10.13, first up is Apwash, whose max health heal on picking up corpses is now 4% instead of 5%, and the cooldown refund on his 1 and 2 from picking up those corpses is now 1 second instead of 2 seconds. Athena loses some HP 5 per level, her taunt is now flat 18 seconds rather than scaling down to 16 in the late game, and her ult is now 120 seconds and has 20% miss instead of 30%. Chernobog's ult also goes up to 120 seconds, and the movement speed and damage mitigation are knocked down as well. Maman Brigitte's 2 now no longer does mark base damage, and the scaling on the mark hits is halved. To be clear, the ability damage itself is unaffected, it's just for the subsequent mark triggers. Poseidon now gains less ability damage at max tide, and his 2 is now 15 seconds at all ranks rather than 16 scaling down to 12 in the late game, and has 10 less base damage at all ranks. Raijin loses 5 base damage at all ranks on his 1. Ratatoska's 3 had its base damage and scaling tuned down a bit. And now for some buffs. First up is Achilles, who now heals for 4 targets on his 2 regardless of ability rank. You used to need to get this to the max to get 4 targets, as well as his 3 is now a lower cooldown early on but the same late game. Bellona's 3 now heals her more every 3rd basic attack, and her ult damage was increased slightly. Tia's Fearless now scales down in cooldown for both stances, and Assault stance specifically has more power scaling. Mulan's 2nd and 3rd rank for her 1 and 2 are now easier to reach. Gilgamesh 1 now deals more damage to minions and had its HP 5 reduced but is now permanently active, not just when the ability is up. Loki gains some base damage on Vanish. Raven gains 5% extra scaling on his 1 and 10% on his ult. Sylvanas 3 no longer suffers from diminishing returns on the stun. Geb's Shockwave now deals more damage to targets at far range, up from 70% of the initial damage to 80%, as well as his shield gets 1 second off its cooldown. Apollo gains 5% scaling on his 1 and a much lower mana cost on his ult. Medusa gains base damage on her 1's Viper shots as well as a lowered mana cost on her 1 and 2. Kronos has more base attack speed now and his 2 has a 1 second lower cooldown. And finally, Zeus ult deals more base damage per tick now. But that's everything you need to know about patch 10.13. Have fun in your games, and I'll catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.